Sheldon Whitehouse just trapped FBI Director Kash Patel in a devastating chronological snare, proving that the Bureau actively buried explosive evidence, and the proof lies in 17 seconds of agonizing silence. On the 3rd of February, a specific file buried deep within the Federal Bureau of Investigation underwent a massive security upgrade, suddenly requiring top-secret special access. This drastic measure did not occur during a kinetic tactical raid or a rapidly unfolding national security threat. It happened exactly 17 days after Kash Patel assumed command as the director of the FBI. This particular file harbored names inextricably linked to Jeffrey Epstein, detailing a comprehensive roster of individuals identified through direct investigative contact at his notorious Palm Beach estate. Rewind to November 14th, 2019. Back then, this exact same document operated as standard, confidential investigative material generated directly by the Palm Beach field office. It was securely locked, methodically processed, and properly categorized under standard evidentiary guidelines. It possessed no extraordinary security clearance and required no restricted access tiers. It functioned simply as another routine file within an expanding archive tethered to one of the most volatile and highly sensitive federal probes in modern history. Yet, years later, this file was violently yanked back into the bureaucratic machinery and intentionally buried far deeper. It was not deleted, nor was it physically destroyed. It was purposefully reclassified. Now transport that specific timeline directly into a morning session of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution. The hearing was officially scheduled using language so aggressively mundane that it naturally repelled public scrutiny, an oversight review of FBI document classification and retention protocols. The room was practically empty, housing roughly 3 journalists and a handful of exhausted staffers. The cameras were actively recording simply out of institutional habit, not because anyone anticipated a historic confrontation. At precisely 9:47 a.m., Kash Patel entered the chamber flanked by 2 attorneys. Gripping a leather portfolio, he radiated the practiced posture of a veteran official who intimately understood how to navigate a hearing and exit without surrendering a single vulnerability. For the initial 45 minutes, that poised expectation held perfectly firm. The committee discussed mundane classification timelines, outlined tedious retention schedules, and described FBI field office reporting structures utilizing incredibly cautious, hyper-controlled vocabulary. It sounded remarkably precise, while effectively committing to absolutely nothing. Patel delivered his answers with smooth confidence, perpetually ensuring he never overextended his reach or stumbled into an invisible trap. This was a masterclass in procedural dominance. It represented exactly how seasoned witnesses successfully drain the clock without ever technically refusing to answer a question. The entire proceeding masqueraded as a thoroughly routine bureaucratic exercise. Then, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse claimed the microphone. He refused to elevate his volume, broadcast 0 signals of an impending escalation, and engaged in absolutely no theatrical performance. Instead, he calmly reached into his prepared folder, extracted a single piece of paper, and rested it face down upon his desk. That solitary, incredibly controlled, and deceptively forgettable physical motion marked the exact threshold where the hearing abandoned its administrative facade and morphed into a devastating exposure. Director Patel Whitehouse stated, "I want to talk about one specific document." He refused to rush the moment, declining to provide any immediate context for his inquiry. He simply flipped the paper right side up. FBI internal correspondence. Reference number EC2019PB047, dated November 14th, 2019. Subject: follow-up classification review, Epstein matter, individuals of interest. Instantly, the atmospheric pressure inside the chamber transformed. It was not a shift you could see on paper, nor something a sterile transcript could ever adequately capture. However, physical postures stiffened, visual attention completely locked in, and the lingering silence suddenly felt drastically different. It grew significantly tighter, substantially heavier, and pregnant with anticipation. This document, Whitehouse seamlessly continued, was originally classified as confidential. He allowed a brief pause, giving the room just enough time to mentally anchor that historical baseline. It was reclassified to top secret special access required on February 3rd of this year, 17 days after Kash Patel took office. That specific revelation acted as the initial point of impact. A document fundamentally tied to the explosive Epstein investigative record was suddenly violently relocated from an accessible federal channel directly into one of the most severely restricted classification tiers in existence. Furthermore, this occurred under the direct authority of a freshly minted director who had not even finished assembling his senior leadership team. That timeline does not represent routine administrative maintenance. It highlights an urgent, highly prioritized executive decision. Patel maintained an unbroken, stoic expression. I am familiar with a large volume of internal correspondence. Senator, you'll need to be more specific. I am about to be. Whitehouse countered effortlessly. What subsequently unfolded was absolutely not spontaneous improvisation. It was the lethal culmination of 11 grueling months of targeted subpoenas, 3 separate judicial court challenges, 2 formal requests to the Inspector General, and a brutally systematic campaign to trace precisely which Epstein-related files were manipulated, exactly when they were altered, and specifically who authorized those sweeping changes the moment Patel seized control of the FBI. This was no longer a simple line of questioning. This was a meticulously constructed chronological trap. Whitehouse proceeded to read 4 specific lines aloud. 4 critical lines extracted from a file that had rested quietly within the bureaucratic system for multiple years. 4 damning lines that directly tethered explicitly named individuals to highly documented physical contact at Epstein's primary residence, spanning between 1999 and 2005. At that exact moment, a reaction materialized that completely defied the standard procedural script. Kash Patel's jaw visibly shifted, his lips parted by a fraction of an inch. His hand pressed firmly down against the wooden table, his fingers visibly tightening just enough to register to anyone paying acute attention. And then an absolute void followed. No verbal denial, no clarifying context, no procedural deflection. For the absolute first time during the entire hearing, the official who had spent the previous 45 minutes brilliantly dominating every conceivable variable in the room completely lacked an immediate response. 17 seconds does not feel incredibly long during a casual conversation. However, inside a formal Senate hearing, while sitting under oath, with broadcast cameras actively rolling and a suppressed document glaring from the table, 17 seconds operates as a monumental event. It provides more than enough time for every single conscious individual in that room to fundamentally realize that a catastrophic error has occurred. It grants enough time for highly trained defense attorneys to actively choose terrified silence over attempting an intervention. Most crucially, it is long enough for the overarching narrative to violently pivot from controlled executive testimony into naked exposure. Observe exactly what transpired within those 17 agonizing seconds. Kash Patel utterly refused to look down at the document again. He declined to ask the senator for any further clarification. His eyes darted exactly once, very briefly, toward his legal counsel, before snapping directly back to Sheldon Whitehouse. That fleeting glance did not broadcast confusion. It radiated intense calculation. It was the unmistakable look of a desperate man rapidly processing his available strategic options and discovering that every single path forward was significantly worse than the last. The core problem was no longer just the isolated document. The true terror resided in the chronological sequence currently trapping that document. Consider the timeline. In November of 2019, the file safely existed, properly logged, cleanly processed, and appropriately categorized as standard confidential material. Then, on February 1st, an internal action memo began circulating directly through the FBI Director's central office. This memo aggressively recommended expedited classification upgrades, specifically targeting documents tethered to sensitive individuals connected to the broader Epstein record. By February 3rd, that exact same document found itself artificially elevated to top secret special access required. This occurred a mere 17 days into the new director's administrative tenure. That is not a random, isolated bureaucratic act. That is a deliberate, forged chain. Once a chain of that magnitude becomes visible to the public, every single connecting link demands a severe interrogation. Eventually, Patel broke the silence. Senator, reclassification decisions are made based on ongoing law enforcement sensitivities and national security considerations that I am not able to discuss in open session. It was an incredibly sterile, clean response. It was technically accurate and structurally completely safe. It represented the exact breed of response meticulously engineered to slam a door shut without overtly appearing to deny entry. Under any standard set of circumstances, that carefully curated language permanently terminates the exchange. However, this was absolutely not a standard chronological sequence. Whitehouse entirely refused to challenge the director's statement directly. He initiated no verbal argument. He simply reached back into his manila folder and deposited a second piece of paper onto the desk. "This one is not classified," the senator firmly declared. A sworn deposition entered into federal court records, Southern District of Florida, 2020. A former employee from the Palm Beach residence of Jeffrey Epstein, 3 years on site, first-hand observations. Whitehouse navigated to a specifically marked section and began reading aloud. "I personally observed Mr. Epstein entertaining guests on at least 40 separate occasions. On a minimum of 12 of those occasions, the guests included young women who appeared to be under the age of 18. He deliberately kept his voice completely level, refusing to accelerate his cadence. He permitted the horrific words to land with the exact same deliberate pace at which they were originally transcribed. I observed these guests being introduced to Mr. Epstein's associates. Among the associates I recognized was..." He executed a brilliant pause. It was not designed for cheap theatrical drama, but for surgical precision. Donald Trump. The room absolutely failed to react in the explosive manner television dramas constantly suggest. There were no screaming outbursts and absolutely zero frantic interruptions. Instead, a profound stillness blanketed the chamber, growing substantially deeper and significantly heavier than before. The document resting on the table had suddenly shed all of its abstract qualities. It now possessed a recognizable name. It featured a highly specific, politically radioactive identity, permanently spoken into the official congressional record deep inside a federal hearing room. Instantly, the previously established timeline violently shifted its shape. The precise document that suffered rapid reclassification on February 3rd belonged to the exact same overall investigative record that currently housed this explosive sworn deposition. It was the identical archive, the very same evidentiary body of material, and it contained the exact same roster of powerful names. Whitehouse ruthlessly connected the dots without ever elevating his tone. Director Patel, this deposition was in FBI custody as of 2020. Part of the same investigative record that contained document EC2019PB047. The same record your office reclassifies 17 days into your tenure. He refused to ask a sprawling, generalized question. He condensed the issue down to an inescapable, microscopic point where deflection became completely impossible. When you made the decision to reclassify that document, were you aware that the investigative record contained sworn testimony naming Donald Trump as a witness to potentially criminal activity at Jeffrey Epstein's residence? This inquiry completely bypassed mundane classification protocols. It instantly transcended debates regarding bureaucratic administrative discretion. It presented a brutal, inescapable binary choice. If Patel answered yes, he admitted to possessing full knowledge, meaning the security reclassification was a highly targeted, corrupt act of suppression. If Patel answered no, he admitted to total ignorance, meaning his executive decision was wildly negligent and completely reckless. Both potential answers carried massive, career-ending weight, and neither path offered safety. For a second agonizing time, the entire chamber waited in suspense. 17 excruciating seconds passed once again. This pause was not identical to the first. It felt infinitely heavier, entirely because the room fully comprehended the monumental stakes behind the dead air. This was no longer a simple mental hesitation. This was a deliberate, paralyzed refusal to actively choose between two equally devastating outcomes that guaranteed massive consequences. Kash Patel remained seated, perfectly immobile. Deep within that profound stillness, the skeletal structure of the trap became brilliantly visible to every single observer. The core question was no longer obscured behind layers of administrative procedure. It stood completely exposed in plain, unavoidable language, aggressively demanding a firm position. If the director answered in the affirmative, the bureaucratic act of reclassification instantly lost all of its neutral camouflage. It would stand as a calculated decision executed with total awareness of the document's explosive contents. It would represent an executive choice that actively and deliberately restricted legal access to critical information directly tethered to Jeffrey Epstein and his powerful associates. Conversely, if he answered in the negative, the decision morphed into something equally horrifying: blind authorization executed without comprehensive knowledge. That degree of administrative detachment remains wholly incompatible with the immense authority of his federal office. Ultimately, his total refusal to provide any answer whatsoever, which was unfolding in real time before the cameras transformed the silence itself into the only reliable signal available. Whitehouse entirely refused to interrupt the agonizing pause. He completely declined to artificially fill the conversational gap. He simply allowed the deafening silence to continuously accumulate. Silence, operating under immense pressure, is never truly empty. It possesses a distinct directional force. It violently reveals exactly where the investigative pressure is being applied and, far more importantly, exactly where that pressure cannot possibly be released. Finally, the senator reached into his folder one ultimate time. He extracted a third piece of paper. It was a remarkably plain, standard, letter-sized document. It bore no visible classification markings discernible from a distance. However, it featured a bold header that every single federal employee sitting inside that room instantaneously recognized: a director's office action memorandum. This memorandum, Sheldon Whitehouse coldly announced, was obtained through a court-ordered FOIA disclosure last week, dated February 1st. 2 days before the reclassification of EC 2019 PB047. The timeline was absolutely not coincidental. The timeline was the entire smoking gun. He read the text with clinical precision. He engaged in no theatrical performance, added zero vocal emphasis, and merely documented the reality on the page. Given the potential sensitivity of named individuals in the Epstein investigative record and the current political environment, it is recommended that all documents containing references to current or former senior government officials or their close associates be reviewed for upgraded classification. He deployed a perfectly timed pause. It was not designed for dramatic effect, but simply to cleanly separate the legal clauses. This review should be completed on an expedited basis. Priority should be given to documents containing references to the current administration's principal officers and their pre-office associations. He slowly lowered the sheet of paper. He offered absolutely no supplementary commentary. He injected zero personal interpretation, largely because none was remotely necessary. The devastating sequence was no longer vaguely implied. It was brutally, undeniably explicit. On February 1st, a formal memo originating directly from the director's office strongly recommended fast-track security upgrades explicitly for Epstein-related files connected to highly powerful individuals. On February 3rd, a specific document pulled directly from that exact investigative record was suddenly elevated to top-secret special access required. Resting deep inside that newly restricted record was sworn legal testimony that prominently featured the name Donald Trump. 3 distinct pieces of evidence, 1 undeniable timeline, absolutely zero remaining gaps to hide behind. Whitehouse deliberately placed the final document onto the wooden table and locked his gaze directly onto Patel. I'm going to ask you one final time. When you authorized that reclassification, were you aware that the document contained sworn testimony that included Donald Trump's name? This represented the absolute breaking point where deceptive language completely evaporated. There was no broader philosophical framework left to retreat into, and absolutely no procedural shield remaining to deploy. The inquiry was brutally specific, perfectly anchored, and entirely supported by verified documents currently sitting before the committee and permanently entered into the congressional record. Once again, Patel provided zero response. His hands remained locked in stillness. His facial features remained aggressively controlled. However, the sheer effort required to maintain that control was now glaringly visible, resembling a fragile surface stretched far past its breaking point. His eyes remained permanently fixed on an invisible point, hovering somewhere between the desk and the middle distance. He was not physically fleeing the question, but he was absolutely refusing to engage with it. This perfectly illustrates what a dead end looks like inside a high-stakes federal hearing. It involves no screaming and absolutely no physical confrontation. It simply requires the methodical narrowing of available breathing room until the target is left with only two remaining options: total exposure or complete silence. And in choosing silence, and choosing to endure it twice, Patel had successfully delivered the single most profound statement of the entire proceeding without ever uttering a solitary word. 17 agonizing seconds. Twice. It was not an isolated moment of hesitation. It had solidified into a demonstrable pattern. And established patterns form the absolute bedrock of any criminal investigation. When Kash Patel finally managed to speak, the atmospheric shift was instantaneous. The change was not entirely about the words he selected, but rather how he delivered them. His vocal register was noticeably lower, significantly tighter, and entirely stripped of the arrogant confidence that had effortlessly carried him through the first 45 minutes of his meticulously controlled testimony. Director's office memoranda are part of an internal deliberative process, Senator. I am not in a position to discuss deliberative process communications in this setting. That response was absolutely not a genuine answer. It was a desperate boundary line, hastily drawn long after the fact, deployed only after the catastrophic cost of a truthful answer had already been brutally calculated. Within a courtroom, during a deposition, or inside any environment where truth is weighed heavily against an established record, artificial boundaries like that are never considered neutral. They operate as massive warning signals. They reveal exactly where the invisible tripwire lies, the line that absolutely cannot be crossed without incurring massive legal or political consequences. Sheldon Whitehouse completely refused to challenge this newly erected boundary. He simply did not need to, because at that late stage, the devastating record was already permanently cemented in place. One, he stated clearly, gathering his documents with the cold, methodical calm of a prosecutor who arrived fully prepared to extract a definitive result rather than a cheap emotional reaction. An FBI document containing witness testimony that includes Donald Trump's name was reclassified to top secret special access, required 17 days after you took office. 2, an action memorandum from your office recommending expedited reclassification of Epstein-related documents referencing senior government officials was issued 2 days before that reclassification. 3, when asked directly whether you were aware of the document's contents before authorizing that reclassification, you have declined to answer. Whitehouse did not elevate his voice for this final summary. He required zero dramatic emphasis because the devastating structure was already fully complete. This represented evidence stacking in its most lethal, simplified form: timeline, authorization, refusal. It required absolutely zero wild speculation and demanded zero subjective interpretation. It was pure, unfiltered sequence. Once a sequence of that magnitude becomes visible to the public, the horrifying meaning begins to automatically assemble itself. This situation transcends mere political party allegiance. It bypasses the immediate debate regarding whether Donald Trump committed an actionable offense, and it avoids prematurely declaring that Kash Patel is guilty of a crime. That is simply not what transpired within that room. What actually unfolded inside that chamber was far narrower in scope, yet infinitely more dangerous to the Republic. A highly sensitive federal investigative record containing radioactive identities existed. A top-down directive was formally issued to aggressively prioritize security classification upgrades specifically for documents tethered to immensely powerful individuals. A file pulled directly from that specific record was artificially elevated to one of the absolute highest classification levels currently available. Finally, when the federal official directly responsible for executing that sweeping decision was publicly asked if he knew exactly what he was burying, he intentionally chose silence over transparency. This is not a wild conspiracy theory. This is basic, verifiable chronology. And flawless chronology achieves something incredibly uncomfortable. It completely removes subjective interpretation from the overarching equation. It brutally forces the public to examine the sequential order, the precise timing, and the specific decision points that completely defy being written off as mere coincidence once they are lined up side by side. Now, take a brief step back from the committee table. Focus on the terrifying element that completely fails to register in a quick viral clip or trend in a generic news headline. If security classifications can be arbitrarily elevated long after the fact, not to legitimately protect active field operations, and not to effectively shield ongoing intelligence assets, but purely to restrict public access to damaging names already securely documented within investigative files, then the fundamental question dramatically shifts. The primary concern is no longer merely what resides inside the suppressed file. The ultimate terror becomes identifying exactly who wields control over access to that file and deciphering exactly when they choose to weaponize that control. And if that institutional control only tightens the exact second those explosive names intersect with supreme political power, then this scandal transcends a single document. It strikes at the very elasticity and integrity of transparency itself. The American justice system is designed to operate in one specific direction. Hard evidence is supposed to steadily move toward public exposure. Official records must march toward ultimate accountability. Names, once formally documented in direct connection to severe wrongdoing, must inevitably face rigorous scrutiny. However, what the public witnessed inside that Senate room was the exact horrifying reverse. Vital evidence retreated violently inward. Access was aggressively narrowed. Most chillingly, the exact moment that corrupt decision was confronted directly under oath, the individual responsible actively chose to offer zero explanation. Therefore, the only question that truly matters is not the one formally asked across the wooden table, but the one that relentlessly haunts you long after the gavel falls. If the foundational rules of justice change entirely depending on whose identity is hidden inside the document, then what exactly are those rules actually worth? Even more critically, who exactly do they apply to, and who is completely immune? If you have followed the evidence this far, you already comprehend that this nightmare is far from over. Hit the like button to ensure this vital breakdown reaches the massive audience that desperately needs to see it. Drop your own analysis in the comments below. What do you believe those 17 seconds of silence truly represented? Share this video with anyone who still naively assumes that silence inside a federal hearing carries no meaning. And remember to subscribe, because the next suppressed document, the next explosive name, and the next shattering break in this timeline is absolutely coming.